Greetings, everyone. I am the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute here at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's gathering, which is entitled Unmasking the Racism in Anti-Racism Education with the Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown. This is the first of 3 consecutive offerings featuring this topic, as the Reverend Dr. Star Brown will take us ever deeper into conversation and reflection next Wednesday, September 25th, and the week after on Wednesday, October 2nd. If this is your first event with the YMI, welcome. If we are well known to you, welcome back. We're delighted that you all are here. For those of you who have been with us before, you'll note that we are using a slightly different format for today's gathering. Reverend Dr. Gia's subject matter is both of the utmost importance and can be controversial for some. For the sake of offering as safe and as brave a space as possible, we've opted to use Zoom's webinar feature for our sessions with the Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown. This will mean that the chat and Q&A are only visible to hosts and co-hosts, and we will monitor those accordingly throughout our sessions and during our 2 Q&A times. That being said, please do utilize those features. We want this conversation to be as robust as possible, which means that we will welcome hearing from you there. Our office has a great staff, and I would like to introduce them to you quickly and thank them for their work. The YMI falls under the purview of the Center for Continuing Education at Yale Divinity School. So we have Kelly Morrissey, the managing director of the center, and we're blessed to have Megan Lukens, our communications coordinator. Thanks to both of you for all that you do, and most importantly, for who you are. If you are new to the Youth Ministry Institute, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a chance. That is yaleyouthministryinstitute.org. We have a whole array of resources on there. We have curricula for your youth, training modules for youth leaders, discussion forums. We have over 1,000 video clips and lectures given by the world's leading youth ministry gurus. We have resources for anti-racism work. We have material for youth working through mental health struggles. We have mission and outreach endeavors, links to other articles. There's a whole lot on there. And all of that is available for free, so please do check out our website. We have a full fall coming up with a few events that I'd like to highlight quickly. Excuse me. This is the first of our 3 webinars featuring the Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown. And we also invite you to save the date for Wednesday, November 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern, where the Reverend Dr. Angela Gurrell will speak to us about how to help youth navigate the digital media landscape in a way that is life-giving and beneficial for their mental and spiritual health. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you all to the Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown. The Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown is an African-American queer pastor. She is an educator and activist in the Twin Cities, Minnesota. She has more than 2 decades of experience advocating for underrepresented communities. With a heart for community and access for all, she stands and activates as a truth teller, as at the intersection of faith, education, and justice. Equipped with a Master of Divinity from Luther Seminary and a Doctorate of Ministry from United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities in the field of social transformation, Dr. Gia Star Brown is ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown, welcome. We are so honored to have you here with us and to learn from you in this space.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I appreciate even hearing about the offerings that YMI has coming up. It's great to know that that you all are investing in these important conversations. So who knows, I may be one of these attendees to some of these future spaces as well. So we're going to dig right in. A lot of people may not know this a little key thing about me, which is that in addition to I'm a mama to 5 children, but in addition to that, the first portion of my professional journey was in education. I designed more than 160 programs and curriculum for not only faith spaces, but also for our public schools here in the state of Minnesota. And so I am passionate about youth and about youth ministry, and definitely would consider this conversation to be a part of our underrepresented communities, right? These youth are definitely a group that is underrepresented. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. And I'm going to put myself into this wonderful slideshow so we can get started. As we talk about unmasking racism in anti-racism education, particularly within the areas of youth ministry. And so as we're getting started, I think it'd be important for us just to kind of understand how we're going to spend our time together. That's important to me, and I'm assuming it'd be important to you as well. We're going to start by, touching on some definitions and qualifiers of racism, so that we kind of know, we kind of have our solid footing on where we're starting from and how we're building out this conversation. Then we're going to move into influences and involvement. And you'll see that number 3 has a space for Q&A. So we'll pause after these 2 huge sections, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So please, as Reverend Jill mentioned, you can certainly put your questions inside of the chat if you have those, and we'll address questions about points 1 and 2 right off the top in the beginning. And then we'll move into resources and solutions, and then we will close with Q&A again and closing remarks. So that's how we're going to spend our time together. And we're going to dig right in where we should be starting, which will be right here at definition. So we're going to start with just defining racism. All right, just kind of defining it. So we have a starting point. It's one of these words, I think, that so many of us have an idea about what it is. And we can kind of sketch out a few ideas, but we may not all have the same corporate understanding. So let's refer to this. I pulled this right offline from the Oxford Dictionary because I think that it is a qualified definition, that racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis, for reasons, right, of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, but typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So we're not here to talk about whether or not people of color can be racist. We're not here to have that conversation. We're here to focus on this portion here, and I'm going to be hovering over this typically space. We're going to be talking about, right, the fact that we're navigating racism as it is applied typically to a minority, someone who is a minority, or a group that is marginalized. So that's kind of where we're going to start there. All right. So one of the things that I thought was really important is to start with a space that is known for being united, for working in this area, the United Nations. Doesn't say that they're always successful, but this organization is known to be a space that came together for the purpose of representing people globally, right? And that's kind of the goal. And I don't know if many people know this, but the 21st of March is known as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So add that to your calendars if you didn't know that. But I thought it's really important. And pulling from some of their work, even from 1966, are some of these qualifiers that I'm just going to hover over really quickly, right? So these are part of their they drafted this document to focus on what is discrimination, racial discrimination, and what are each state party or each group, what are the members of United Nations, what are the requirements to ensure that we are moving forward with this vision. So you'll see that some of the pieces say that there is a focus to not sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination. And I'm a word nerd. So I'm all about language. So I'm recognizing that we're widening this definition now, right? So, they're saying that even to sponsor, to defend, or in any way to support racial discrimination is a challenge. And we're going to dig deeper into that this morning, or for me this afternoon for you. The other thing too is that, there's this, look at this, the second piece, to adopt immediate. So there's an urgency here and effective measures. So not just measures, but effective measures. So even, right, how we're going to even define, effective, how we're going to evaluate that, we're talking about it. And they say, particularly in the fields of teaching, education, culture, and information, right? And there is this lens that they are kind of putting up here, right? A lens to combat prejudices that lead to racial discrimination. and to promote understanding and tolerance and friendship. So now there's relationship added here among nations and racial or ethnical groups. So this is important for us to recognize that we're widening this now, that if we are going to say that we're moving toward being an anti-racist society or a nation or an organization or a community, then it requires some work, right? Requires more than just saying this is what we're doing, but look at all this. This is heavy undertaking, right? And we're also saying that it can't be done from a distance. That relationship is key. Relationship is key. And look at this, United Nations condemns all propaganda and all organizations that are based on ideas and theories of superiority of one race or group of persons of one color, ethnic origin, right? So they're kind of they're widening this, letting us know that, my goodness, we have a lot of ground to cover. But also in addition to that, this here says that we've got to do more, that there's more that's needed. So we're looking at not only, even from looking at this language, we're not looking at what we're focusing on today. Remember, this was drafted in 1966, right? This is when this originally started, was coming together in 1966. So where are we now? Right? And we are still, and this is still something that we are moving and pressing toward, right? So I just want to kind of lift this up. We'll come back to this, or I'll refer to this, but just to see, this is a starting point, and this is what it means. If we're talking about being anti-racist, this here is what it means. It's beyond a declaration, but it requires some real intention and some labor and some work. All right. So one of the things I think is important as we're talking about racism is I've kind of I wanted to kind of look at and focus on three different categories or buckets of racism. So if you attended the first webinar back in May, you may have remembered that I lifted up Mayan Letran. If she is ultimately ever watching this, I've never met her, but I think she's brilliant, and I give way too many plugs for her work, if that's even possible. But I love her work because she very successfully and intentionally, shortens the gap between violence and racism, and really puts together a definition that associates racism in that kind of in-your-face way. So let's look at what she says in her chapter 2. She says, if violence, so we're starting with violence because racism is violence. Right? Qualifiers of racism is violence. And we assume that violence is, and it is, physical violence and physical harm. But she's widening this, just like we assume that when a lot of us assume that when we see racism, we only title it as racism if there is a physical, right? If there's a physical push or if there's something blatant that's right here. But racism thrives between the lines, right? So let's look at this here. So she says, if violence is defined by the three characteristics presented earlier in the chapter, in chapter 2, they were the erosion of essential vitality. So just being able, having, the vitality in life. It was rationalized by normalizing built-in logics, the way that we've always done things. This is the way that it works. If it's delivered with potent force that's seen and unseen, right? There is no option. This is what you must do. This is how we must facilitate this classroom. This is the way. So if there is this kind of straight connection, there's force, we might appreciate the severity of racism then as a form of violence. So recognizing that even that racism, while physical violence is definitely a part of racism, but now we're looking at the fact that even those between the lines, even when there isn't a physical, when physical harm is not applied, there still is, racism still thrives and exists, and it is still violent, right? So now we're looking at the fact that we're widening this to recognize what Mayan Letran is saying, right? Is that racism is violent. The other thing I think is a qualifier is anytime we're looking at something and there is some sort of a us versus them or an othering, if there is a superiority or a division that happens that somehow separates or sets people apart, right? This is the way that we do things. This is the way we've always done things, and we just kind of divide. Then that's a challenge, right? That also be qualifier of racism. Let me give you an example. Now remember, nothing in here says intention, right? Nothing in here says that. So these things can happen even if we're not intentional about it. I'm going to give you a key example that happens in a lot of classrooms, even by well-intentioned facilitators in youth ministry. We are, imagine we are so interested. Usually this happens, and I'm African American, so I'm leaning toward my lens, right? So I'm just going to lean toward that, but it definitely is applicable across the ethnic spectrum, right? So here it is for me as someone who's African American and or an individual who's in a classroom, and we're in Black History Month. And there is an importance to talk about the struggle of African Americans. And so much so that even with this heart of wanting to share that, the one person or the two people who might actually identify as African American in a white majority space would be asked, not necessarily invited, right? But asked. So there really isn't, look, this kind of force, right? So there really isn't an option, but would be expected to share their own personal views for the good, for the benefit, for the overall education in the group. And while that might be an intention, right, well intentioned to want to give voice, right, we recognize that there also that harm also happens to that person who then I'm constantly saying that people of color in white majority spaces, regardless of age, must be bivocational. Because not only are we there for whatever the role is that we have to do, whether it's a student or whether it's a teacher or whether it's a pastor, but we also are expected to be the educator, to be the voice, to be the representation of a particular group, right? So even though the intention in this example I gave you might be to give voice and open space, that specific example forces, right, this individual who may not feel comfortable, where trust may not have been established, when safety may not be established, when desire may not be considered, expecting them to share. And because they feel as if the options are limited to say no, because there isn't an option, there is a superiority thing that's happening here. That even in the desire to bring people together, division happens here then, right? Because immediately I am set apart. I'm divided. And it's recognized, right, that I am here. And now I'm here as a lesson. I'm here as someone as a teachable moment, right? So here is this piece. So just as a qualifier, we're looking at these pieces. Now, I'm not talking about our intention, right? I'm just talking about what actually happens. This is what happens, and harm happens. And if harm happens, whether it's physical or otherwise, that's violence. These are qualifiers of when we're looking at racism in settings. And then you look at number 3, I talk about mis and exclusionary treatment, mistreatment, exclusionary treatment, right? So here is this idea does that, even if we're bringing, like, take this example I just shared with you about this one or two, people of color in a classroom, students of color, and the expectation that they will share. A question that I lift, and I'll return to this later on in the presentation, is does the activity or the lesson or the experience uplift everyone in the room? Right? So even if the intention is for open sharing, does little Gia, right, little me, walk away from having to share feeling uplifted, or do I feel heavy? Education is not a space where we get to celebrate the majority. Our goal is to bring education to all, right? And to make sure that everyone has access. So recognizing that this piece here, that there are times when the way that we deliver information or lessons, there are times when when there's separation that happens, when there's mistreatment, it's considered mistreatment. There are times when there's an expectation of sharing or of being set apart, or if you can't do this way, then now that's a behavior issue versus a potential cultural challenge. Without the lack of that relationship, without the lack of that awareness, then exclusionary mistreatment happens. Right? So these 3 pieces are just qualifiers that I wanted to lift up for us as we're kind of getting our footing in this discussion, to recognize that these are areas that we oftentimes don't consider when we're thinking about what racism is. These are the areas of that. I'm going to keep moving. Keep moving on in the presence of time, but we will have time to have questions and answers and conversation. I'm just going to remind you of that. So one of the things I found in the Scholar Strategy Network was something to look at. I'm moving into now, the second portion of our agenda. So as we've kind of qualified what racism is and how it comes to life, how we can see it coming to life. I'll give you another example I want to make sure that I lean into. Exclusionary. If I'm going into white majority faith space and the music uses language of light and darkness imagery, or right, I mean, these are examples of exclusionary treatment. Even if we don't intend that, that would then, right, qualify as racism. If I'm in a space and I'm feeling as if my presence and my involvement is not of equal standing, equitable standing as everybody else, if I feel separated, right, then this is where we land in this space of racism. So scholars say, so I was interested in how do we get here? What influences the way that we provide this information to our youth ministry, to each other, and to our students? What is it? How do we get here? And the reality is that we are, even in youth ministry, we're not the only sources. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. We're not the only sources of education that our youth are exposed to. They're exposed to interaction. They learn from interaction. They learn from the media. They learn from their peers. They learn from their family. They learn, right? I mean, so love and hate and racism, these are emotions. These are perspectives that are taught. Okay. And so who are our teachers? I wanted to know that. Now, I said I'm a mom of five, and they are teens to young adults. So I'm right in the youth ministry space. And I'm also aware of how they have increased, their engagement with the media, particularly with social media, which also has now, a lot of people say that is another teacher, another influence. And look at what they said in the Scholar Strategy Network. In 2015, the average US resident consumed traditional and digital media for about 15.5 hours each day. That was almost 10 years ago. 15 hours a day is whether we are listening to music or watching TV or we're listening to a podcast, or we're on social media, 15 hours a day. And that number has largely stayed the same over the years, right? And look at this, and even 8 to 12-year-old children, right on the cusp of this youth ministry piece, consume an average of 6 hours of media a day, and teens consumed 9 hours. So what are they consuming in 9 hours? And look at what the Scholar Strategy Network says. When there's a lack of contact between racial groups, when we don't have relationship, then people tend to rely on media stereotypes to formulate ideas about people outside of their own race. And this is what happens a lot of times. And I'm so grateful for the word that Reverend Jill lifted up, that this conversation can be controversial, because it certainly can. A lot of times as a consultant, I've traveled to other states and also to rural spaces within Minnesota where I live. And I hear a lot. I hear this from people who say, but there are no people of color in my congregation. So I don't really, how am I supposed to do that? Or why is this important? Why do we need to spend so much time on this if we're never going to come in contact with other folks? And I always say, we don't build and establish curriculum or programs only for the people that we are representing or that we're hoping to serve or that we're serving right now, but we also envision our vision. Who are we hoping to serve? Who are we hoping to bring into this? And who are we hoping to affect by what we're teaching? We know that for us, particularly in faith spaces, if you are a member of a tradition that falls underneath Protestant Christianity, for example, then we know that spreading the gospel is loving ourselves and our neighbor, loving God and our neighbor is the primary. That is our focus, is to spread the gospel, right? And so if that is our focus, is to do that, then the question comes in: how do we do that? Without relationship, how do we do that? Even with youth that are in smaller rural congregations, they may not always be there. In the future, this world, they're saying, we already know stats are saying that those that are considered to be minorities will become the majority, and that white folks will become the minority soon, right? So as we're thinking about this, we need to be preparing our youth for engaging and interacting with people that are growing up in contexts and with lenses that differ from theirs. theirs. So this is our teacher. And so right off the top, they say, but when there's a lack of contact, when there's a lack of relationship, then we rely on these stereotypes, we rely on what's happening, we rely on what our peers tell us, we rely on what's said around the dinner table at home, we rely on what our friends are telling us in school, we rely on the hymns that we sing, we rely on these things. And look at what they said here, some of these stats, that even looking in this, relying on media and the stereotypes, they say with this, in watching these images, there is a decrease in self-esteem for all girls and for Black boys, for Native Americans, and an increase in self-esteem for white boys, because media casts white men as heroes, erasing or subordinating other groups as villains, sidekicks, and sexual objects. This is what, by the time our youth are coming into our spaces for youth ministry, this is what we're up against. And we should know this. We should know what we're up against, and who our students' other teachers are. Look, there's a negative impact on white people's perceptions of people of color, and racial stereotypes in film and television can exacerbate pre-existing racist fears. So we're being taught to fear each other. We're being trained to stay distant from each other. We are being trained, right? Even our youth are being trained to recognize people as villains or sidekicks and sexual objects. This is what we have to combat. And even if you are not a follower of Jesus, and you subscribe to a different faith tradition, I don't know of any. I do know of a couple, but the majority of faith traditions lean toward positivity and growth and unity and solidarity and justice. So this should be inflaming for you and for us in this conversation, because this is what our youth have already, and not just once a day, 9 hours of this. They're steeped in this. Popular media depictions of nonverbal features of people of color, including facial expressions and body language, influence racial biases for white viewers. So just to recognize that this is what we are navigating as we are looking into youth ministry. Sometimes there's this perception that we are coming with a clean slate, that we have this moldable, right? And it is moldable, but none of us are clean slates. And by the time we connect with people, we have to be aware of that. And so part of the awareness is we have to name it, we have to be mindful of this, and we have to address it. Now, I am a Gen Xer. So I was here, and I was a teen before social media. And I was raised in different contexts where the way that we engage these conversations, what was prevalent was either they weren't engaged at all. So we just didn't talk about that, which we'll talk about in a moment. They weren't engaged at all, or they were engaged in a lopsided type of way where my role and my presence was prescribed before I stepped into the space. These days, media has grown exponentially, which means that I'm getting exponentially older. Media has grown exponentially, right? And what I say is the reaches. Now we're getting information in minutes about what's happening around the world. Much of our learning, even education, happens like this online. This has become routine for us to connect in these ways, to rely on media and media resources for the purpose of education. So as we're coming in, it's important for us to recognize that we're already coming in needing to push back on some of these ideals. And it doesn't serve to pretend or to just not discuss them. It doesn't serve anyone, because I will tell you too, as I'm sure many of you are, that if you're in youth ministry, you've engaged with youth, it doesn't help to not talk about it. Youth are talking about these things all the time. They're talking about what's happening in our political realm. They're talking about these things. There are youth that are speaking up, that are standing up, and are looking for people to continue to help them understand the world and the shape that it's in. And for us who are passing this on to youth, we have a responsibility to do that. Right? And it's in our best interest, isn't it, to make sure that we are preparing our young leaders to move forward in this world. So by not talking about these things, do our intentions, do we prioritize our well intentions to the learning experiences and needs of our students? Are we doing that? All right, so look at this. These are just a couple of examples of what I'm talking about in the media that came in the last 8 years. Some of you may remember this here. This one up here was really active for a while. Dove came out with this, and it was before and after. So here it is, nonverbal. Nobody's talking. But look at that image, and what does that message send to me? So even by the time I'm coming in, I say this because you see this decrease in self-esteem. Because as someone who is in youth ministry, who is a follower of a faith tradition that believes in uplifting the identity and the experience of all people, right? Then I should know that I'm coming in to serve people that are coming in with low self-esteem, that are going to need additional support. That this doesn't allow me to have a cookie cutter anything. You see what I'm saying? Because some are coming in with unbelievable low self-esteem. Some of us are coming in with huge ego complexes. Some of us are coming in feeling really, really having these ideas and these fears already preset. So as you're coming in to a fight. That's what I want you to see, that a battle might be a better word for us. We're coming into a battle. So look, I'm coming in. If I'm a student coming in, I'm coming in. And if I'm in a white majority space, then and this is what I've left and this is what I'm seeing. Imagine where my head is at in a space where I might be asked to share experiences, or where I might be asked to put myself on the chopping block, to be open about some things, or to just pass on some other. Look at what's happening in my mindset as a student that's coming in to see that this tells you that whiteness is the ideal. So if I see that and I'm walking in, what messages, right? I'm heavy and I'm burdened. And so youth ministry, our role then is to uplift. And if we're going to uplift, we have to recognize this. Look at this other one that also, it has been removed now from PlayStation, but this was also an active promo for PlayStation 4, right? White is coming. Portable white is coming. Look at this. This was back in Hurricane Katrina time. Even the language that's used, and don't worry if you can't read. I'll walk you through it really quickly. These were the Associated Press, right? And the AFP. They came together and they were talking about the effects and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And look, the Associated Press talks about, here's this person. Look here, this young man who looks as if he is, right? He's clearly a person of color, and walking through this floodwater, and the word says looting. Even the language, I'm a word nerd, looting a grocery store. And look at the same thing. Now, here are people who identify, looks like they might be people that belong to that might subscribe to being white, right? And so here's this image here. And look, and now they found bread. So one says they're looting and one says they're finding. This is what is happening. So these types of things, without relationship, without contact, these are the images, the mindsets, even the implicit biases and the stereotypes that are forming our frame of mind, whether we know it or not. Whether we know it or not. And so whether we know it or not about ourselves, we have been subjected to this type of violence as well, let me just say. So as educators, we've been subjected, but our students have as well. And so this is important. By us not talking about it doesn't mean that they don't see it. See? Because now, remember I said, now we have access to information. These are things that they're seeing by the time they come into youth ministry. These are conversations that they're already having. And so then the question is, can we afford to stay with a cookie cutter, rainbow, and I always say running through the sunflower lily fields, right? Can we afford to provide this when really this is what they're seeing? They know that the world has been is this way as a result of the architecture of racism. Like they already know that. And so by ignoring that, it doesn't do anything for the conversation. But let's look at where it started, right? How did we even get here in the first place? How did we get to this space to where we're having a lot of these different images, to where we're dealing with Dove and how did we even get here? I get that question a lot, and it goes back to Carl Linnaeus. And I want to actually lift this up. I'm not sure how many people may be aware of who Linnaeus is, and what he did. But Linnaeus is known in the 1700s, was known as the architect. He was known as the father of taxonomy. He was known to have put together classifications of plants and mammals and animals. He was known to do this work and then moved into this field of expand his classification to begin to classify different areas of humanity. And he created this chart in 1767. And I'm showing you this. This is active. It's free if you to the Linnean Society. So I went right to the website, and this is what's on it. And I'm just going to show a couple of things. I think this is important. We think about how did we get here? Let's look at how we got here. He uses species. This is what it is, right? And Americanus, very interesting. Americanus, and look at some of these qualifiers in terms of their build and body. Red skin, right? Straight black and thick hair, gaping nostrils, beardless chin, disposition, unyielding, cheerful and free. Clothing, paints himself in a maze of red lines, governed by the customary right. Interesting that this would be the word that's used for our Native Americans, right? Saying that even at that time, someone is calling them the first Americans, right? So just kind of naming that in American. But look at Europeus, right? European, 1767, white, sanguine, muscular, plenty of yellow hair and blue eyes, light, wise, inventor, innovator, creator, protected. Even the words protected by tight clothing and governed by rights, right? Also, in another way for governed by rights, and that's the word governed, like God is on our side. God is on our side. We're governed by God. I don't know about the others, but we're governed by God. Look, an Asiaticus, right? So our siblings of Asian descent, sallow, melancholic, and stiff, blackish hair, dark eyes, stern, haughty, greedy, protected by loose garments. And look at this, governed by opinions. Ego. These are the things. Look, Africanus, black, phlegmatic, lazy, dark hair, twisting braids, flat nose, right? And look, even to have some other pieces of just other pieces down here, lactating profusely, sly and sluggish and neglectful, anoints himself with fat, meaning that African people of African descent, we're looking at like animal skin and clothing and things like that, governed by choice. We're just willy-nilly out here doing whatever we were. We're governed by choice. This was 1767. So while we want to say we think this is so far away, it's actually not as far as we think. Those seeds that were planted in the mid 1700s have informed our lenses, the lenses that are used to depict and classify people today. It's still here. And we still see these images. And these are things that we find, whether we know it or not, whether we agree with it or not. The reality is that this is where we have been, right? And this is what has informed our communications, and this is what's informed. So even the low self-esteem that people of color, that students of color have, even this portion right here has been, we can follow the trails of how we have landed in this space. Okay. So as we're talking about this, I think it's important for us to talk about, like, how do we address this? I also am a facilitator of an anti-racism initiative called Building Racial Consciousness, which was developed by Anthony Galloway. And what I think is really important is this conversation that we've all been socialized differently around race. Some of us, just to recognize that while we may look at this and all of us may be shocked, right? And clutching our pearls, and we may say this is unbelievable, and I agree with you, it's unbelievable. And at the same time, how we talk about things, this is why I'm saying how we talk about things matters. We assume that everyone approaches race and racism in the same way. We assume that if we're not talking about it, parents are talking about it, schools will get it, it'll happen in the congregation, their friend, right? We assume that's not our work. Right. But let's look at how we've been socialized. Some of us have been socialized to remove race from consideration completely. I'll get to the Statue of Liberty images in a moment. Some of us will have led to that, to just remove, we don't even talk about it. We are focused on the character and the individual of each human being, and we don't even discuss the race at all, which is harm, which is harmful, which is violence, right? Because if we're not talking about it, then we're saying that, then there's a message that is sent that then, if we're not talking about race, then when racialized events happen, then how do we explain that? Gaslighting tends to happen in this space of color blindness, right? Not believing people tends to happen in this space of color blindness. Look at racial awareness. Some of us have been raised to recognize and to notice racial difference. We don't really say anything about it. We can see it, so we're able to notice it, but that's it. We may not talk about it, we may not know how to engage it. And look at where we're going to racial consciousness, to be aware of the racial nuance, patterns, and impacts. So to be aware of the nuance, patterns, and impacts of racism. And so these are three different ways we've been socialized around race. And I really appreciate, I found this image of the Statue of Liberty, and I want to hone in on the chains, because this really was a good example of this. We know that the Statue of Liberty has been, my entire life, again, I'm Gen X. My entire life, I've been known, Statue of Liberty has been known as a symbol of freedom and of liberty. And of justice for everyone. And we know this. This is what I was taught. This is what we all have been taught. It's a beacon in our country. It's right there. And one of the things you notice is, here's my cursor, is that the Statue of Liberty is holding, like, do you see this? So she's holding like a tablet. But she wasn't always holding a tablet. Leclerc was the designer of the Statue of Liberty, and Leclerc actually wanted to put chains in her hand, because we're talking about slavery. We're talking about, people who felt as if they didn't have freedom for ideas and choice and religion, and to live their life to the fullest of their ability. And so he wanted to have these chains that are here. And folks said, oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We don't need that to be the story. We need the story to be that this is freedom, and we are open, and we are serious about this. Well, he kept the chains and put them in the bottom down here. A lot of people don't know that. When I Googled why the chains are, I just went online and I just went into my search engine, and I wanted to know, like, why are the chains at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty? And in 0.8 seconds, all of these responses came up. Some people said, oh, the chains are there to hold the statue in place. Some people said, oh, it's just another part. It's a way that the sculpture is constructed. That's a way they did things back then. And then there are some people that said, well, these are the chains of slavery. These are the chains of the history that's here. And look at what's happening, is they're being swept under the rug at the bottom where you wouldn't even see them, right? And it reminds us of how we, even today in our modern climate, are working to sweep these conversations under the rug. There's active sweeping happening in our country, right? When we think about it, you think about books being banned, we think about people's voices not being included, we think about the fact that people's rights are not being given freely, they're having to fight for these. And so even the story, the way that the story is being crafted, I sometimes will daydream. Like, I wonder if we were to move to the 2000s, if the chains would have even made it to the statue at all. Given where we are right now, they probably would have been removed completely, right? But it's important for us to know this, because as we're thinking about this and how we're moving through, how we're talking about this, as we're discussing this, it's important to recognize that even if we aren't the originators of that thought, even if we aren't the creators of these beliefs and stereotypes, we are products of our environment. And we carry this generationally, we carry this in our psyches and in our systems, whether we know it or not. It comes out in our education. It comes out in our curriculum. It comes out in our silence. It comes out in our suspicions, right? I mean, these are the spaces. And so important piece is one, that we can't remove race from consideration. We can't just not talk about it, because kids are talking about it everywhere. It's being talked about everywhere. They're seeing that everywhere. And so if we want for youth to have trust in the church, which oftentimes is a symbol for God, then we've got to make sure that we talk about the areas of life that ail us. We've got to be able to have a space to talk about it. And if youth feel like they can't have these real conversations, where do they go? When their dinner tables aren't wanting to talk about it, when the gaslighting's happening at school, church is supposed to be a space of refuge. And so even if we are in youth ministry with white majority spaces and there are not a lot of people of color, they are, just like we are, engaging with people of color, and we have a responsibility to ensure that we're moving the needle a bit to prepare and equip them for where we're moving in the future. Because if we continue to not talk about it, my goodness, these chains are still here. If we continue to not talk about it, then that's what we're teaching people to do. We're teaching our youth to not talk about it. We're teaching our youth to gaslight each other. We're teaching our youth that history doesn't matter. This is what we're teaching them, even if we're not saying anything at all, which I love about that scholars quote that says, even the nonverbal, because it isn't just about what we say, it's about what we do. Right. Some of these exercises for us, even as youth ministry leaders, we say, hey, sometimes we have to look at ourselves. Are we as teachers being influenced by people that are racially conscious? Are we going to spaces where that's being openly talked about so that we are equipped with the language and the tools to be able to have these conversations in appropriate frameworks? Or are we comfortable in our spaces where we are? Do we just leave that to the cookie cutter writers of curriculum to just like, they'll get it? But this is so much more important than that. Okay, so let's continue this. Desmond Tutu says, if you are neutral in the situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And I love this because it says that we can't do the lukewarm stuff anymore. We can't do that, that even lukewarm, is neutral. So if somebody comes in and they say that they have been the target of racism, and we don't address it, or we don't talk about it, if we are kind of paralyzed and frozen, if we say that something you should talk about to somebody else, then even if we personally don't agree with it, we have chosen the side of the oppressor. Our responses, right? There is no, it's one or the other. It's one or the other. And in a lot of public secular spaces, in like public schools, we may not have the space or the latitude to be as vocal about this injustice in the same ways and urgency that the church can. So when these things happen, we have the right and the responsibility to interrupt it immediately and to address it with the same urgency that the person who brought it to us has. Right? So I look at this involvement. It isn't just about, I looked at three different types of involvement. I looked at participatory, collateral, and perpetuation. Most times when we think about racism, we go right into this participatory. Well, if I wasn't the one that said it, if I wasn't the primary actor, then these other things don't matter. That is only one way to be involved in the process, in the operation, in the institution of racism, is to be the actor, the primary actor. But then I look into number two, collateral, and it reminds me of a lot of the anti-bullying campaigns, where they say to just stand by and watch it happening. You are a bully as well. You are participating in this event as well. So even to witness things and witness the effect of it and to do nothing about it puts us in the space in the space of racism. We are now linked to that space, right? So when we're thinking about how we are connected, it isn't only just because we personally are not saying these things. We are connected and associated with racist practices if we are not saying things that we have seen. And then also I looked at number 3, perpetuation. If we are passing along these ideas, ignorance is bliss. I'm just the one that's facilitating the curriculum. I'm just the one that's implementing this. If we are not looking at the ideas, if we're not looking at the roots and addressing what's happening, even in our passing along of information, then we are perpetuating, we are involved in the act of racism, even as we are moving this along. And I say that because as someone who is a writer of curriculum and have written a lot of youth and youth ministry curriculum, this is important to say that even that we are responsible for what our students are teaching too. We don't get to say, if you have a problem, go to the author. Because in what's our role then as gatekeeper, as educator, if we're not perusing and looking to see where this is, right? So part of this is also looking at how we are participating in this system, this ecology of racism. Are we just participators? Are we actors? Are we witnessing it? Are we sharing this along? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing right now. Just because this is a time when I wanted to make sure, before I moved on, just to address any questions about what I have lifted up so far before we get into resources and solutions, right? So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But right now, I'm interested in any questions that you have about the materials that I've lifted up first.
Reverend Dr. Gia, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. And folks, if you do have a question, please put it in either the Q&A or the chat. We're watching both, so feel free to have your voice heard there. I have a couple for you, just to get us started. So you spoke about the fine line between allowing individuals of color to name and claim their lived experience without also necessarily putting them on the spot to do so, right? Helping them know that this is an optional thing. This is not because of your lived experience, you have to share this. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on there's a major danger of tokenism here, right? Especially if there isn't a trusting mutual relationship underneath the asking and the telling. And I'm wondering if you can name some of the complexities because I was the one who asked you to come today, right? There's honesty there in saying that, hey, I can't speak to this stuff. And it is helpful when others feel called to do that. But there is always a dance too of saying, I don't want to make you do this, right? So can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that question. Um, I'm a storyteller. So let's move into that space to be helpful. Um, let's replace the word racism with assault. Let's assume, sadly, this is a real deal that people are victims of sexual assault, and that teens are victims of sexual assault. Let's replace that just for the matters of this conversation. If you knew that someone had been a victim, as if we did, as a youth ministry leader, knew that a youth had been a victim of sexual assault, would we approach them by saying, share this openly with the group about what that was like, and because it's similar trauma. Racism, I want you to say, they're not the same, but it is trauma as well, is what I want you to see. Racism is trauma, right? And here this. So let's kind of move into this space. Like, would we say, come share this for the benefit of this lesson with the group? We would never say that. We would not. Now, if somebody wanted to come and share, if there was it doesn't mean I can't talk about, the problems of assault in my lesson. It doesn't mean I don't need for someone to be a victim of assault to be able to talk about the dangers and how to protect them, right? Even me being queer, we know that we don't out people who are queer. I share when I'm ready to share, but that doesn't mean because I don't share that we don't need to have a lesson on this. It means that they are not right. I have the ability to and they're not mutually exclusive. I, as a facilitator, I have the ability to have a conversation about race or racism. I have that ability. I don't need someone in the class to have that discussion. I would never put someone in the place and expect them to share their trauma, right? Because they would be reliving it over and over again. Now, if that person feels safe to share that, then that's an open invitation. So what happens is, here's what happens. Let's keep this in the same frame of mind, right? Um, I, as a youth ministry leader, know that I'm going to talk about sexual assault with my youth ministry. I may know, even from a personal relationship, that there's someone in my class, a student, who has been a victim of this. You already know where I'm going, right? I would go to that student. I would have a conversation ahead of time. I would say, this is what I'm going to do. Tell me how to protect you and how to make you. If you don't want to come, I would listen. I talk to their family. We don't do the same things about race, but it's trauma as well. It doesn't mean that the conversation doesn't need to happen. My son is a senior in high school, and I remember as a freshman that there's a video. Again, I'm Gen X. There's a video about like consent. It's an animated video, which is so good, but it like gives all of these, and it's like a 3-minute video, and they watch this video every year, right? And it doesn't mean that somebody in the classroom has been someone who has ignored that discussion. It doesn't mean we still need to have the discussion because we know that it's going to come up someplace else. And so the same thing is the same with race. We need to have the discussion, but you don't need to have somebody there. I always tell people the evidence of the progression of equity in our country is when a white person can celebrate Black history without needing someone like me to be there to do that. When a white person can get up and can do the thing, right? And so you don't need to have someone that's there, but recognize that even discussions of race can carry trauma because remember, we've all been socialized about race differently. We don't know what's going to be said. Inviting the conversation, means that you are also, inviting responses and inviting connection. And so it's your responsibility, just like you would with sexual assault, to protect. It's your responsibility to ensure that the way you bring it up, the delivery, which we'll talk about in solutions, your responsibility as an educator to have that same type of care. But it doesn't mean that the conversation doesn't need to happen, right? I just don't need to be the one that needs to say it. Now, if I feel comfortable coming out and saying, I want to share, if you came to me before the lesson and said, this is what we're going to do, and I say, no, I feel comfortable, I want to share, great. Now there is this conversation that's happening. But if it's not, if I haven't asked, if I haven't come to you, then that shouldn't even be something that's happening in the classroom. We shouldn't even be inviting them because you don't need someone who has been there to tell that story. It just re-traumatizes them. And it reminds me of something I've said before. I say it a lot of times for imagery of a pig on a skewer. Of this idea of like, and I say that because you remember back in still in other cultures, people grill and eat, and eat over this fire. And I just imagine people, around this big meal and they're just eating and look at this poor pig that's just being emptied. And it's just and once people have got their fill, they leave. And so what does that do for the Black or the student of color? What does that do for the student who has navigated anti-gay challenges? What does that do for the student who's been a victim of sexual assault if we're just like picking off of them for our education to fill us up and then we leave? But that leads back to my question: is every single child, reflection question, being uplifted when they leave? At the end of this, is every single child being made whole when they leave? And that child or children or person would not be, right? Because do they feel better by sharing those things? Would you feel better by telling a whole bunch of people that you have no or little relationship with about the personal, intimate details of your assault? Why would we ask people to do that? Because racism is an assault. We would never do that.
That is super helpful. Thank you very much. It's a helpful clarification.
Yes, yes.
Someone asked in the chat, they are curious to hear more about direct and indirect involvement. Can you please provide some examples of sharing in those two different ways, and how might this be done in a youth group setting or church setting?
Um, I appreciate that. I try to keep it as so we're not as finger pointy as possible. When we teachers are sharers. That's what I'm saying. When we're teaching, if it's our curriculum that we've written, that's another conversation. But usually we're handed curriculum or we select curriculum, and I'll give more examples in the next section about some solutions. But what I'm talking about is how we're taking this that we've got and we're reading and we're teaching it and we're passing it along, and we may not have explored gotten in detail like who, which we'll talk about in a moment, but the resources that we're using, the source of those resources, the lenses of the writers of those resources, the fact that the reality that a lot of the work that we do is cultural, the ways that we manage conflict, the ways that we cultivate relationship, the ways that we define relationship, our expectations. I mean, all of these things, learning styles, there are cultural elements to all of this. And a big portion of this in terms of is like we are perpetuators. Now, are we going to be perpetuators of anti-racism, of inclusion, of equitable spaces, or are we going to be perpetuators of racism? Even if we have no idea or we didn't write it, if we are sharing this information, then we are a part of a cog. We are a cog in this system. And are we a cog in a system that is moving toward anti-racism, or are we a cog in a system that is continuing to perpetuate and condition people to be products of a racist environment? And so a lot of times, and I'll dig more into that in the next section, but that's what I mean by that, is whether we are teachers, whether we are on social media, we're sharing stories, we're sharing information, where our role is, hey, I no, but you have a responsibility and an accountability, and even passing these things along. If you haven't done your research and your work, if you haven't considered some of these pieces, then we are also then perpetuators of racism. And that's what I mean by unmasking the racism in anti-racism education. It's not only, which we'll talk about in a moment, not only the sources, but it's in and how we bring it, but the fact that we are, right, this is what we're doing, right? And anytime we are passing this along, our role is still a part of this. It would not have been passed if it wasn't for us. It would not have been shared, right? So the way that we are sharing this information puts us as participators in the work. Yeah. I'm aware that we're at 12:02. But I want to check. I want to move on to the next segment, but recognizing that it won't take long. We're going to move into solutions, and then there'll be time at the end. I'll leave a good, I'll try to wrap up in like 10 minutes, so we'll have 20 minutes for a conversation. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. So this is where we left off, I believe, as we're talking about, right? So this is kind of where we left off right here. And thank you for your questions. I appreciate that. And I want to make sure that that we answer them all. So I appreciate that. Let's look into resources and solutions. So the first thing I'm going to say is that I'm interested in your curriculum sources. So I'm interested, as someone who writes curriculum, I write curriculum for youth ministry as well as for adults. I'm always interested in the sources. Sometimes we get it, we hear it's great, we take it and we move it, and we use it. But this is a part of that indirect piece that I'm talking about, is have we done our work? Are we looking at who's writing the curriculum? The reason why I say that and why it matters is because I'm writing from my lens. And we've talked about this in the beginning of the sector. We talked about the lenses. And so I can only teach from my lens of lived experience. Otherwise, I'm just regurgitating what I have learned in my own setting. So if I'm just regurgitating what I've learned, the majority of authors of theological studies are white and are white men. Right. And so that means their lens is a lens that is coming. They can write from lived experience. Well, their lived experience may not address the effects of racism in particular ways for people of color where they will be seen and heard because they wouldn't have had that experience. It may not have been a priority or may not have been a factor for them. Having, so recognizing not only who our students are, but who we want for them to be in the future, who we want for them, their formation is really important. And so hearing authentic stories and voices from people of color is critical to them being able to see things. I can sit in a whole, and there's value in me sitting with a whole bunch of African Americans and having theological conversations. I'm not saying that they're not without value, but let me tell you, there's so much value. It's enriched when I make room, when I move over for the stories of someone that may be that may consider maybe Latine or maybe Buddhist, right? Buddhist tradition. There's so much more that I can learn from these experiences that are coming here. But if I'm just focusing on my lens, well, I'm looking at what I've learned. But that's the problem with our anti-racism education is that the writers of anti-racism education are largely white. And so then how do we know then where does my voice or people's voices come in that can say like who's evaluating this? So the authors are really important. Who's writing it? And there are people like me and others who write curriculum, write curriculum and tailored curriculum. There are people who do this, right? And then also, generational learning, being aware that these are the sources of how we learn. Not only do we learn by what we're taught, like traditional learning styles, but we also learn from what's been passed along to us generationally. So, and we teach by what's been passed along generationally. We teach by what we have learned. As teachers, we're also students. And so we are teaching what we have learned. So recognizing that we are also, even if we don't know it, we are contributing, imparting a part of our own lens into this. How is the community involved? I've said this third time I've said this, is that when we're looking at who we're teaching, we're not only saying if we're teaching white majority students, then we don't need to have conversations with people of color. No, you really do. And you do for the purpose of who do we want our future leaders to be, but also, how do we amplify the voices that usually aren't heard? People that are in marginalized communities don't get asked to contribute to youth ministry curriculum. Not routinely, right? People that are living in subjugated housing are not usually asked to come in and speak to a group of youth. But my goodness, why not? People who are receiving, federal and government assistance are not considered to be an authority on anything. But why not? Because if we're talking about injustice, why wouldn't we go to the source? Why wouldn't we do that and invite people through relationship, not tokenism, right, to do this work? And I will say too, I love this quote, and it's a love-hate quote because it holds me accountable. Toni Morrison says, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Well, gosh darn it, Toni. And she's right, because the reality is that what I'm talking about largely does not exist. That's why I started creating curriculum, was because I said, you know what, it doesn't exist. And this means that you may have to innovate. That means that you may have to supplement. If you know that the curriculum you have, that your congregation or that you have purchased for XYZ hundreds or thousands of dollars, and you're stuck in that contract and you can't do anything, but whatever it might be, all of the reasons and excuses and all of the things, I get it. And it doesn't stop you from going to an activity and supplementing it and widening it and saying, okay, this curriculum says that we're going to talk about this, but you know what? I wonder if I could bring in some community speakers to talk about this. I wonder if there are some activities or some songs or some music that I can integrate that could help. So really innovation means that you may have to supplement what you've got. And there are tons of resources for that. Even as I'm thinking, there's some I didn't put in that I feel like I want to put in. In Minnesota here, for example, the African American Registry, the AAR, you can look that up, but they have documented, they are one of the premier curated spaces of curated African American history and content in the nation. And they have recorded interviews for like half a century. Like they record these videos of people that, and not only African Americans, but also the intersections and the relationships that are intended to be used for educational purposes. So even if you are in a space that where there are resources that are here. So the first thing is the curriculum sources. The second thing is your own self-discovery. I say do your work first, right? Because you must be a student before you're a teacher. If you're pulling up an activity, and racism is something that shouldn't be a theme, like a subject. This should be like in a foundation in every day, right? People eat every day. People sleep every day. We make accommodations for lunch and rest and nap time every day in our curriculum, in our CYF ministry. This racism should be a constant part. If I'm teaching math, I can find a way to lift up, someone of color who has been an incredible mathematician. I can talk about how the math has been used for the inequality of the economy and what's happening in these spaces. There's so many ways where I can take the framework that I've got and I can widen it, right? So I just want to say that. But let me go back to this piece. It starts with you. You taking the curriculum, you doing the activity first, do it first. Recognize where are your triggers and biases in whatever it is that you're teaching. What's missing here? Asking that question, is every child going to walk away feeling uplifted once I've added these things? Recognize how you're coming into this, because delivery and implementation is everything. And I lifted up Harvard's implicit association test, which is, it measures the attitudes and beliefs that people may be unwilling or unable to report. So even not even knowing that we have these biases, it allows us to be aware of them. And if you're aware of them, then you can integrate them, right? You can make room for the fact, hey, I recognize that I've got this bias when it comes to people, when it comes to things, in matters of ableism. And I recognize that. So then I may need to go and get some help or support to facilitate that in a way that is uplifting and honest. So I have to do my work first before I can teach it. So it requires you doing this work, right? And then adjusting the activity and the implementation, and what that means. And I say this because it isn't easy. I already know it's not easy. I know that what I'm calling you to do is not a simple thing, as easy as going to a bookstore or getting online and ordering curriculum and coming. I get that. But you know what? If it was easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because people that are much more intelligent and brilliant, in our ancestry, that have been working on anti-racism, would have found these solutions. It's not easy. And because it isn't easy, you may have to actually like build your own road. You may have to do that. But if you're committed to this work, that's what it is. It's this muscle of having to flesh it out and supplement, and also coming as an honest and vulnerable example of a work in progress, to your students, because you can't hide that stuff from kids. And then finally, let's look at this delivery to implementation. Because delivery is important. We've got to manage and widen those expectations, like I said, and also consider and integrate intersectional notes. I am an African American, but I'm also an African American woman. And so what uniquely then are the experiences of Black women? Rather than lumping everybody together in one particular space, what about people who are Native American and queer? Right? Also known as two-spirited, right? Sometimes, like, how do we integrate the realities of these experiences? How do we do that? Because if we don't, and we only keep it at Black or Native American, and we just keep it surface, then that's how we're teaching our youth to have these conversations, is surface. And we're teaching people then to ignore what's beneath the surface. But we've got to be able to uplift the fact that feminism was for white women. And Black women did not have the same access, and because they didn't have the same access and the same opportunities, then what white women were fighting for, which was important, didn't include Black women. And the reality is that there's an intersectional piece that's missing. So we've got to adjust the definition of education to include these intersections, and to make room for the fact that people can be more than one thing. People can be white and queer. People can be Asian American and hearing impaired, right? People, right? I mean, we can do these things, and we also have to. I want to kind of, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, in a previous, in the first webinar that we had, is that, we have to also widen our experience of education. If the majority of our theologians and the ones that have created and authored the works that we teach and have taught us how to teach have been white and through their lenses, then the way that we're teaching has also been adopted largely from them. And so there isn't room to qualify lived experience. There are colleges now, they've been doing this for a while, that will say, yes, if you're transferring into our school, you can certainly bring your transcripts. But there are some colleges that will also say, let's add in lived experience as credit too, because there's something worthy in how you've lived your life and what you've done. But we don't qualify that. But lived experience is here. Are we making room for people to share as authority, even students, right, in the classroom? Are we making room for innovation? And recognizing that this activity or this concept or this theme is not what it needs to be. And innovation is widening that and beginning to dream about what it could be. Will every child walk away unharmed and uplifted in whatever the conversation is? A really big question. And then I'm just going to say this before I stop: to scan our agenda and activities for cultural elements that may be derivative of white supremacy culture. Like, when are we starting? Right. And I say this because there's a really, I'm going to name it, that there are times when African Americans particularly have been associated with, I wonder where we got it from, being lazy, right? We saw that already, right? And also being late. CP time, colored people time, right? Which we should never say. And like these sorts of things, this idea that comes from that. But really, people, I talked about this. There are two different types of the ways that people engage in relationship. Some people are all about getting it done, starting on time, being focused, and other people focus on not the time element, but on the people and the cultivation of relationship, which means that start time may be at 9, but maybe there's relationship and talking in the beginning, in the first few minutes before we move into the activities. Maybe there's room for people to come and to bring the full expressions of themselves. Maybe prayer isn't something that's been pre-written and prescribed. I have journeyed through 5 denominations to get to Disciples of Christ, and in every single denomination, that has been white majority denominations, have involved pre-written prayers. But in the African American culture, freestyle praying, popcorn praying, breath prayer is our traditions in Buddhist traditions, right? I mean, there's so many other ways that prayer can happen instead of saying this is just the way that we do things here, right? How we engage with people. Are we doing big groups, small groups, even the ways that people are comfortable engaging with other folks? How are we discussing things? For me personally, I tell people that are colleagues and friends of mine, that I interrupt a lot. And I don't interrupt in this culture. Interruption is rude. But in many other cultures, interruption is actually welcome. It's a sign of relationship. Think of finishing your sentences and sharing thought and vibing with each other. And so even these things can be cultural, is what I'm saying. How we're giving directions for people to do things. The steps that are made. How are we navigating conflict? Some people are quiet and are conflict avoidant, and they have been, culturally, that's how they have been taught. Others are very focused and are walking toward the conversation. But the way that we frame it can't be an objective umbrella where we assume every single person responds the ways that it does. And so even looking at the ways that we are delivering the information and the implementation are really, really important. Finally, I just want to say that here are some resources that are here. Here's that Reset the Heart. I found this to be interesting. This book here, You Are Your Best Thing, by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Brene Brown, as you may know or probably know, is known to really focus on vulnerability and shame. But one of the things that Burke and other folks have said is that, you know what, there are some racialized components that are not being recognized in this conversation of shame and vulnerability. Sometimes it isn't safe for me or someone to be vulnerable in a space? How do we have those conversations? One of my mentors is Dr. Annie Lockhart Gilroy, and she has focused on youth ministry. And so she wrote this book on nurturing the sanctified imagination of urban youth. And I think whether or not youth are in an urban settings, I think there's just so much really quality information that's there. And then finally, these bottom two are just curriculum guides that I've written based on poetry by Joe Davis, who is an African-American spoken word artist here in the Twin Cities. And I took the artist, I took it and wrote this comprehensive holistic curriculum. And so just telling you, like, these are things that are out there to say that there are other resources that are here. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. I have a video if we have time for it. But if not, then I will give it to you, Reverend Jill, to put in the chat for people to watch. It's a spoken word poem that I thought was really great. But most importantly, let's dig into some questions for the last bit of our time that we have.
Thank you again. This is really rich. Okay, so one question that Stephen asks, can you address the fairly widespread sentiment, particularly among young white males, that they are the ones being discriminated against? They see anti-racism as something that is dangerous. How do you speak to these folks about institutional racism?
It's a great question. My first thought before answering that is my first thought is fish don't know that they're in water. If I have lived my entire life having access and experiencing the world in a particular way, and that has been my lived experience, and then to encounter new information that I need to share some of the things that I've had that other people don't have as much as I do. That can be, I mean, I'm in my 40s. I don't like to share all the time, right? So I think a piece of this is recognizing the challenges for white youth in now it could be construed as like, now we're flipping the script, like now we're having conversations about affirmative action and now we're doing these things, but the reality is like, this is the way that it always should have been. Sometimes I will give examples. I'm a big storyteller, and when I've written curriculum for even young students, like even elementary school students about this, I will do things like get a scale, one of those scales, and put certain things on it for people to be able to see who has what and how do we make it equitable for people to recognize, and to maybe to explain that I'm not asking you to give away, right, everything that you have. What we're saying is that we need to level the playing field so that everybody gets to experience the same joy that they have. And we can't be people who are followers of these types of justice-centered faith traditions and not believe that everybody should have access to the same. And so I reorganize, reframe the conversation because it can feel like losing. And let me just say that it is. It is losing. It is having to give up some things, and it doesn't feel good all the time because there's power and privilege, and it doesn't feel good. And now here's an opportunity, a gateway for me to also share. I wonder how we can have empathy for people who never had that. Like, I think about the quote, I'm horrible with quotes, but to have loved and lost, is it better to have loved and lost and never to have loved at all, right? And so even I think about that, like, the fact that like some people have never experienced some of these things and at all. And so if we putting it in that context of that saying, I deserve to feel love and to experience love and to share love as well. And so it may not feel good because of this, but righting the wrong can be good, and it is good. And so I think changing the conversation in a way that changes the lens from focusing on myself to and what I'm losing to what other people are gaining, right? And it's going to cost something, because true anti-racism costs something. It's that muscle memory. It's gonna cost. But it's a reality. And sometimes if I'm living in my world and I'm in a fish and I'm in water, I don't even know I'm in water, I can't really recognize that. And I need help to see it. And this is the role of youth ministry, to help to see these things, to point them out, to use Jesus as an example of this, and to share this. So like, you giving up some things doesn't mean that you don't have everything like that you need. Nobody's saying, right, give. But what's hard is to expect everybody to give from their cups when some are overflowing and some are empty. And how do we make this more equitable? And so leaning toward the compassion and empathy and really asking people to change their gaze and make room for others' experiences, this is something I think can help along with the conversation. Doesn't mean that people are going to be happy about it. I mean, I have to tell you that, right? I mean, if the hopeful outcome of these discussions is that people are going to walk away feeling excited and happy, I mean, nobody, that's not the case. But truth doesn't always feel good, right? It doesn't always feel good. But my goodness, does it prepare us for the days to come?
Yeah, and if I could add a moment there, or one other thought, as the straight cis white person in this conversation, just a little bit, people are all on their own journey of understanding these topics. And we are, as ministers, going to encounter people who are at the very beginning stages of that journey. And that's a tender time. Um, the hope there is that you can, as a leader, nudge folks along without
Mm.
shoving them into the deep end too quickly, right?
Right.
So being able to teach people and meet them where they are, it's a manner of accompaniment, but also not leaving them where they are, and not in one's own being or in one's own leadership saying that where they are is acceptable, because it might not be, right? But being able to say, yep, like I see you, I see where you are coming from with this, and there is more to the story, and let's talk about that, right? So I think there are it's all about approach and thinking through, and who is called to do that work, right? Because it's a lot easier for me as a white woman to actually say that, I think, than it is for others whose identity is on the line there. So
Right.
I think that's
Right.
important.
I agree with that, because it's really, because the difference is when I talk about it, I'm fighting to be seen, right? Like I'm fighting to prove that I'm worthy of being seen and of that equitable space. Like
That's
even
right.
the catalyst for this, versus if you're doing it and if you're having the conversation, it frees me from the burden of that
That's right.
responsibility, because there are other folks that are in this that are seeing the value. And so a lot of times anti-racism education, facilitated by people of color, is really, it's more than just giving the information. This is my livelihood at stake, and I feel like I'm almost on trial, right?
Right.
Because how you receive this talk affects how you carry it out in your youth ministry. And so there's a huge weight,
Yeah.
that's put on, on me, burdened on me, to make sure that it's shared, versus if I'm not put in that role to convince, to persuade, to prove, then I get to be a participant, and I get to be a part of the conversation, and it's so freeing then when other folks are having that conversation for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
We have other questions, and there is one about the availability of slides. That's not a question I can answer right now, but we will get back to you on that. And mercifully and gratefully, we have the Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown with us for 2 more weeks. So there are a couple of really good questions that I have taken note of that we will find time for in the upcoming sessions.
And thank you for your time and your attention. I hope that you found this conversation, this presentation valuable. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. And we'll continue to dig deeper as we unmask the racism inside of anti-racism education. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.